Okay, so you want to buy an airport. Find a piece of land, pour a runway, let the planes land, collect the fees. It sounds like the closest thing the modern world has to owning a toll booth that nobody can ever build a second lane around. One way in, one way out, and everyone who wants to fly anywhere near your city has to go through you. No real competition, because nobody is building a second major airport next door to yours. That's the dream, and it isn't entirely wrong. The problem is, everything that happens between the dream and the reality, what it actually costs to get in, what it costs just to keep the lights on, and why some of the most sophisticated infrastructure investors in the world have still managed to lose staggering amounts of money on airports that, on paper, should have worked perfectly. Let's start with the obvious question. Who actually sells an airport? For most of history, governments built and owned airports outright, treated as public infrastructure funded by taxpayers. That started changing in a meaningful way in the final decades of the 20th century, as governments realized they were sitting on extraordinarily valuable assets, and private investors realized that a monopoly with guaranteed growing traffic was exactly the kind of thing worth owning for the next half-century. Today, airport privatization is common across large parts of the world, structured in one of a few ways: an outright sale, a long-term concession where a private operator runs the airport for a fixed number of decades before control reverts to the government, or a public listing on a stock exchange. The concession model has become the most common because it lets governments raise enormous sums of money without permanently giving up the underlying asset. When investors decide what an airport is actually worth, the number they care about most is EBITDA, essentially the airport's earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization, a rough proxy for the pure cash-generating power of the business. A well-run, well-located airport commonly trades somewhere in the range of 15 to 20 times its annual EBITDA, sometimes more for the best assets in the biggest cities. That multiple tells you something important about how this business is actually valued. You are not paying for what the airport earned last year. You're paying for a monopoly position in a city, effectively forever, for as long as commercial aviation exists in that market. What if you can't buy an existing airport, and you want to build one instead? The first thing you need is land, and a lot of it. A full-scale international airport typically requires somewhere between 50 and well over 100 square kilometers of flat, legally cleared, structurally sound territory, land large enough to include runways, taxiways, terminals, cargo facilities, and enormous buffer zones for noise and safety regulation. Acquiring that much land, clearing legal title, relocating or compensating everyone displaced, and confirming none of it sits on protected or environmentally sensitive ground can cost hundreds of millions of dollars before a single shovel goes into the ground. Then come the runways, and a runway is not simply a very long road. It's a multi-layered, precisely engineered structure built to absorb the repeated impact of aircraft weighing hundreds of tons, landing at high speed, tens of thousands of times a year, for a century or more, without structural failure. Building a single major runway in a developed country routinely runs well past $1 billion once you include the surrounding taxiways, lighting systems, drainage, and navigation infrastructure required around it. This is why proposals to add even a single additional runway at an already established major airport are so consistently controversial and expensive. The cost of adding capacity later can dwarf what it costs to build the original facility. Then there are the terminals, which are not really buildings so much as small, permanently operating cities. Automated baggage systems moving tens of thousands of bags an hour through kilometers of underground conveyor networks. Air conditioning and ventilation systems processing enormous volumes of air continuously. Security infrastructure that has to meet strict government explosive detection and screening standards. Jet bridges engineered to match dozens of different aircraft door configurations. Backup power capable of running every safety-critical system simultaneously. All of it operating continuously, every hour of every day of the year. Because an airport, unlike almost any other piece of infrastructure, effectively never closes. Here's the trap that has destroyed more airport projects than almost anything else. The moment you borrow money to build an airport, and you always borrow money, interest starts accruing the day the loan lands, not the day construction finishes, not the day the first plane touches down. Every month of construction delay is a month of paying interest on billions of dollars in debt while generating exactly zero revenue. There's a well-documented case that captures this trap almost perfectly. In October 1975, Canadian authorities opened Montreal-Mirabel International Airport, built on an expropriated property spanning nearly 40,000 hectares, at the time the largest airport site in the world by land area, and envisioned as the primary gateway for Canada's international air travel. The final plan called for 6 runways and 6 passenger terminals capable of handling up to 50 million passengers a year. The site was chosen well outside the city it was meant to serve, on the assumption that a dedicated high-speed rail link would be built quickly enough to connect it efficiently to downtown Montreal. That rail link was never completed. Passengers instead faced a long drive to a terminal roughly 40 kilometers from the city, while the older, more centrally located Dorval Airport remained open and increasingly preferred by both airlines and travelers. The airport had cost more than $1 billion to build, and yet it never handled more than around 3 million passengers in a single year, a fraction of what the facility had been engineered for. Just 29 years after it opened, Mirabel's passenger operations ended entirely, the last commercial flight departing in October 2004. For the following decade, the operating authority spent more than $30 million simply maintaining the empty terminal building, before ultimately deciding demolition made more financial sense than renovation. When asked why, a spokesperson for the airport authority put it about as plainly as this business ever gets summarized. The land, she said, was worth more than the building. That's the sharpest version of the trap, but it plays out in smaller ways constantly. Even routine airport construction projects in developed countries regularly run years behind schedule and hundreds of % over original budget, driven by fire safety system failures, baggage handling systems that damage luggage during testing, subcontractor disputes, and regulatory redesigns triggered midway through construction. None of these individual problems is typically catastrophic on its own. Together, compounding month after month, they can turn a project budgeted at a few $1 billion into one that costs 3 or 4 times that, opening years late, sometimes directly into a downturn in global air travel that nobody could have predicted when the original financing was arranged. There's a second, quieter version of this same risk that shows up not in construction, but in demand forecasting, and it's arguably more common than construction overruns because it doesn't require anything to go visibly wrong. A regional airport authority in a fast-growing part of the world spent heavily in the early 2010s expanding a mid-sized facility, betting on projections that showed passenger traffic roughly tripling within a decade based on regional economic growth trends at the time. The expansion was financed almost entirely with long-term debt, structured on the assumption that rising passenger volume would comfortably cover debt service within a few years of completion. The expanded terminal opened on schedule and on budget, a genuine success by construction standards. But actual passenger growth came in well below the original projections, partly due to a broader economic slowdown in the surrounding region, and partly because a low-cost carrier that had been expected to base a significant portion of its regional operations there instead chose a competing airport nearby that offered even steeper fee discounts. The airport was left with a modern, well-built terminal sized for a passenger volume it wouldn't actually reach for the better part of another decade, servicing debt calculated against traffic that simply hadn't shown up yet. Nothing about the construction failed. The forecast did, and in this business, a wrong forecast can be just as expensive as a collapsed roof. When an airport finally does open, or in this case, finally does grow into the capacity it was built for, money comes in through 2 fundamentally different channels. The first is aeronautical revenue, fees charged directly to airlines for using the basic infrastructure, landing fees calculated by aircraft weight, a per-passenger departure charge, and fees for parking aircraft at the gate or apron. This sounds like it should be the core of the business, and historically it was. But here's the catch. In almost every country, governments impose strict limits on how much airports can charge airlines, precisely because the airport is a monopoly. If your city has only one major airport, and you want to fly there, that airport could theoretically charge whatever it wanted without regulation. To prevent that, aviation regulators typically conduct periodic reviews, often every 4 or 5 years, and set a maximum allowable charge per passenger. Airport operators frequently dispute these caps as too low to finance the infrastructure investment regulators simultaneously demand of them, and those disputes can drag on for months or years without resolution. The structural reality of aeronautical revenue is straightforward. The government tells you how much you're allowed to charge, and the answer is reliably less than you'd like. Because aeronautical revenue is so tightly capped, every major privatized airport in the world has built a second business inside the first one, a business regulators mostly leave alone, that grows faster than passenger numbers, and that generates margins airlines could only dream about. That business is everything that isn't the runway: non-aeronautical revenue, parking, retail concessions, food and beverage, car rental commissions, real estate leasing, and advertising. Commonly accounts for well over a third of total airport income at major hubs, and it has been growing faster than aeronautical revenue in most markets for years. Parking alone can be one of the single largest line items on a large airport's commercial revenue statement, sometimes generating well over $100 million a year at a major hub, because airports typically have an effective monopoly on convenient parking near the terminal, and premium covered parking can run well over $100 a day, with essentially no regulator watching the price. Retail works through a structure called a minimum annual guarantee, where a tenant, a duty-free retailer, or a restaurant commits to paying either a fixed percentage of gross sales, commonly somewhere between 15% and 20%, or a guaranteed minimum payment, whichever is higher. This protects the airport's income on the downside. A bad year for the shop still generates the guaranteed minimum, while a great year means the airport takes its cut of every additional dollar sold. None of this retail revenue happens by accident. Terminal architecture is deliberately designed to maximize how much time passengers spend near these shops. After security, widely considered the most stressful moment of the airport experience, designers frequently introduce what's sometimes called a decompression zone: lower ceilings, softer lighting, wider open corridors, signaling to a passenger that the stressful part is over and it's safe to relax, which in commercial terms means safe to spend money. Many major duty-free areas have no direct route from security straight to the gates, forcing passengers to walk through the retail zone whether they intend to shop or not. A layout that studies have repeatedly shown meaningfully increases retail sales compared to airports where shops sit off to the side of the natural walking path. All of that revenue looks excellent on paper. The reason airport ownership isn't an automatic fortune is what you have to spend to generate it. Security alone is a permanent, non-negotiable cost center, every passenger and every bag screened using equipment that must meet evolving government standards, and when those standards are upgraded, the airport upgrades its equipment, with no real choice in the matter. Baggage handling systems run continuously underground, drawing enormous amounts of power and requiring specialized engineers on call around the clock, because when the system fails, the airport effectively stops functioning. Utilities at this scale are staggering. A large terminal complex can have more enclosed floor space than several city blocks of office towers combined, running continuously, every day of the year, regardless of how many passengers actually walk through it. None of these costs change meaningfully based on how busy the airport is on a given day. It doesn't matter whether 20 million passengers come through in a year or 10 million. The runway still needs plowing after a snowstorm. Security still has to be staffed around the clock. The lights stay on. The only real variable is revenue, and revenue is precisely the thing that can collapse overnight when global travel is disrupted, while the fixed costs of running a facility this size barely move at all. Not every airport faces the same version of this problem, because not every airport has meaningful passenger volume to lose in the first place. Airports handling under roughly 1 million passengers a year almost always operate at a loss, structurally unable to generate enough parking revenue, retail spending, and aeronautical fees to cover the cost of a facility that has to stay open around the clock, regardless of how many flights actually use it. Many of these smaller airports survive purely because a government funds the shortfall for political reasons, regional economic development, rural connectivity, national prestige. The more interesting problem shows up at small and mid-sized airports trying to attract passengers without that kind of government backstop. The typical outcome is dependence on a single low-cost carrier willing to bring in volume in exchange for steep discounts on landing fees and direct marketing payments that function, in practice, as subsidies flowing from the airport to the airline. If that carrier ever decides to pull out, the terminal can go from busy to nearly empty within a single scheduling season, and the airport has very little leverage to stop it. Now let's look at what happens when an airport does everything right, at real scale. The largest, best-located hub airports in the world routinely operate with operating margins that would be extraordinary in almost any other industry, sometimes well north of 50%, because at high enough passenger volumes, the fixed costs that crush a small regional airport become a rounding error against the enormous non-aeronautical revenue a busy terminal generates. A hub airport isn't just a piece of infrastructure an airline uses. For the busiest global hubs, it's a connection point that entire airline networks are built around, meaning the airline effectively cannot afford to route around it even if it wanted to, which gives the airport a form of pricing and negotiating leverage that smaller facilities never achieve. So, is owning an airport actually a good business? The honest answer depends almost entirely on scale. A small regional airport handling under 1 million passengers a year is very likely losing money, structurally, regardless of how well it's managed, because fixed costs simply cannot be spread across enough passengers to reach profitability. A mid-sized hub, somewhere in the range of 15 to 25 million annual passengers, tends to be where the economics become genuinely attractive, non-aeronautical revenue grows faster than costs, retail contracts become valuable, and parking demand is stable enough to essentially run itself. A mega hub above roughly 40 million annual passengers is a different category of business entirely, facing the heaviest regulatory scrutiny and the largest capital obligations, spending billions on constant terminal expansion and fighting periodic fee reviews, but generating more cash at that scale than almost any comparable infrastructure asset on the planet. So if you do decide to buy an airport, understand what you're actually buying. You're not buying a business in the conventional sense. You're buying a piece of infrastructure that forces every airline serving your city to pay you, forces every traveler passing through to walk past your shops, and forces every driver who parks there to pay your rates. In the right city, at the right scale, with the discipline to survive the years it takes to get there, that's one of the most durable positions in global business. The question that actually decides whether you profit from it isn't how good your airport is, it's whether you can survive long enough for the scale to finally start working in your favor.